Shalom, brethren. We continue the last of the 2 Corinthian studies of what's needed for salvation. Today's chapters 10 to 13, titled Satan's Transformers. Reading from verse 3. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war against the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of Yahweh God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of the Messiah, and having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. Verse 7. Do you look on things after the outward appearance? If any man trust to himself that he is Christ's, let him of himself think this again, that as he is Christ's, even so are we Christ's, or the Messiah's. Verse 12. For we dare not make ourselves of the number, or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. Verse 18. For not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom Yahweh commendeth is approved. So, many people think they're doing the right thing because they're in a denomination that tells them they're doing the right thing. Or they read books and videos and things of people who come from the same cloth or belief as them, repeating the same thing that they believe. So they're comparing themselves with people of their own beliefs. And Paul's saying that is not wise. Measuring your belief by people who believe the same thing. If that was the case, no one would have followed Yeshua. They'd follow the Pharisees or whoever were the leaders of that time. So I think a grave error of believers and seekers is to think their knowledge is sound and safe according to what their denomination believes or from what they have been exposed. One does not know what they do not know, and should always be checking that they are on solid ground rather than sinking sand. Not by comparing themselves with others of the same denomination and belief, but with those who may have gained other knowledge and even differ from their beliefs. I know this can be dangerous for many who are not able to rightly discern truth from error, but we must also be mindful of 2 Corinthians chapters 11 and verse 13. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of the Messiah. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. So no, just because you're a pastor, you have many people in your congregation, doesn't mean they're all believing or following the right thing. We must also remember Hosea chapters 4 verse 6. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of God, which most people today have done. Forgotten the law of God, or just concentrate on the New Testament and think the law of God was for the Old Testament or for the Jews, and such deceits of those devil who makes themselves ministers of light. So, forgotten the law of God. That is the purpose of these Genesis to Revelation studies. For you to see the common theme and instructions of God that led to pleasing him and his salvation compared to what displeased him. I think you should by now see it was having faith in him and keeping his laws in all cases. For both Jew and Gentiles, one law for everybody. It is that one commonness that the deceiver wants you to doubt, using the New Testament errors of understanding of, i.e., grace, faith, or belief in Jesus, so that you become one of those of Matthew chapters of 7 verse 23. And that says, and then will I profess unto them, that's those who came and said they did all these wonderful things and were more or less believers, and then I will profess to them, I never, and I repeat, never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity. So here we have people who believe they were doing right, believe they were pleasing God, believe they would get into heaven or get the promise of God, and came and said, let me in one sense. And Yeshua said he never knew them. Never means never. Not even when they were baptized, going to church, giving their tithes, all the things they thought they were doing right, even then he never knew them, because they were baptized into, how does the Bible put it? Corruptible seed, corrupted denomination, not spirit and truth. And in fact, not only were they never knew by him, they were actually working against him. They were actually committing iniquity by following a system of false belief, even though they thought they were worshipping him, like those who came down, who were thought they were worshipping God when Moses went up to the mount, dancing around naked and forward Aaron saying, these are the gods that brought you out of Egypt. And it was not the God that brought them out of Egypt. If it was not for Moses, God would have destroyed all of them in their ignorance and in their false beliefs. So, commit to your heart and head the memory of 1 John chapter 3 verse 4. Whosoever committeth sin transgresses also the law. For sin is transgression of God's law. Get that committed to your heart, to your head. Sin is transgression of God's law. Verse 8, he that committeth sin is of the devil. Romans chapter 3 verse 31. This is for those who think they just need faith. Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. Yea, we establish the law. Romans 6:15. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? God forbid. A common belief of people, we are saved by grace, and they forget we are saved by grace through faith. So even faith or grace does not excuse us for keeping God's law. And the third one, those who think just believing in Yeshua is sufficient. Galatians 2 verse 17. But if, while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves are also found to be sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? God forbid. So Christ does not minister, does not teach you or to be a sinner. He's not a preacher of sin. So we cannot use faith, grace, nor belief in Yeshua to break God's law. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. Devour is a very serious attempt to destroy you. 2 Corinthians chapters 11 verse 7. Have I committed an offence in abasing myself that you might be exalted, because I have preached to you the gospel of God freely? Verse 13. For such are false apostles, as I said, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. So many pastors, big congregations on TV, evangelists, fit into those ministers, false ministers of righteousness. They have transformed themselves into those positions. God has not given them those positions. So continue my comment. Like the devil used the words of God to deceive Eve in the garden, and similar attempting to tempt Yeshua in the wilderness, so he and his agents transformed themselves as ministers of light, like a wolf in sheep's clothing or minister's clothing. The purpose as with Eve and Yeshua, is to get your misunderstanding of God's instructions or his law, which will lead you to disobedience, transgression of God's law, as you just read above. From the 300 plus days of study, since we started these studies on the 1st of January, we should, and all the things we discovered, the Old Testament, the law of God, the prophets, the Psalms, the three things Yeshua said spoke about him and pointed people to him. So from 300 plus days of study, we should have seen obedience to God's laws is the key. Not the one relating to animal sacrifices for forgiveness of sins, as we have a better lamb in Yeshua. The sacrifice system is part of the law and the gospel of God. So remember, I said God gave on one hand things for us to do, such as Exodus chapters 20 to verses 24, verse 12. Moses wrote all those things in the book. And then in Exodus chapters 25 to 31, he gave the forgiveness system, the tabernacle system, if we transgress those laws. So God always had a system of forgiveness in the whole complete laws. Things to do and things to get forgiveness, and a method to get forgiveness of if we're breaking these laws. So the system has not changed. We still have these things we have to do, but we have a better system of repentance in the blood of Yeshua. That is the gospel of God. Now the deceiver and his ministers would like you to think whenever you read law, it refers to the whole set of what the Jews have counted to be 613 laws of God, rather than the specific one of, i.e. circumcision or animal sacrifices that Paul talks a lot about, circumcision in the New Testament. It does not, meaning the law, when you see the word law, it does not refer to all of God's law. You've got to read it in context, as I've covered in previous studies. Murder, stealing, adultery, and transgression of his holy days of convocation listed in Leviticus chapters 23 are still sin. And in the New Testament, 1 John chapter 3 verse 4 says, whosoever committeth sin transgresses also his law, for sin is transgression of his law. And as I said, 1 John 3 verse 8, he that committeth sin is of the devil, for the devil sinneth from the beginning. So if we break God's holy days, do not keep them, we are transgressing his laws. Now, I hear people say we are not to be legalistic. Legalistic is not a term in the Bible. It is a term that's been, it's a created term by those who do not want to keep God's laws, such as the ministers, those people of the devil who make themselves ministers of light and want you to think negatively against keeping God's laws. If it is legalistic to obey God, when he says to obedience gives you life and disobedience gives you curses and death, then I would rather be legalistic than go against God's laws. We keep all the laws of man, whatever country we're in, whether it's parking laws or paying taxes and so forth, and we do not call it legalistic. So why do we apply obeying God? Why do we apply the term legalistic and do not want to be legalistic to God's ways when we are legalistic, if you want to use that term, to keep in man's ways and the law statutes of the country? If a policeman says you are breaking the law, he does not mean every single one, but a specific one according to the context of the reason he or she stopped you to speak to you. It could be a traffic violation, a theft or other. So if when they say you are breaking the law, you know it's not every single law in the land, is one specific one, use the same intelligence when reading the word law in the Bible. Okay, continue from 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 22. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. So here we see firstly, I'll pause a minute, a Hebrew and an Israelite are two different things. Yes, you can have an Israelite who's not a Hebrew. When it all came out of Egypt, the whole congregation were Israelites because they all came under the nation of Israel, but they were not all Hebrew. Only Jacob's direct descendants were Hebrews. So Hebrews and Israelites are two different groups. So let's carry on. Paul again. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Verse 23. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labours more abundant, in stripes above the measure, in prison more frequent, in deaths often. Of the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes, except one. 3 times was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. 3 times suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeying often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils amongst false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fasting often, in cold and nakedness. Besides those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. So that is what it calls to be a follower of Messiah. Take up your cross and follow him, as Paul just says. It is not a prosperity preaching that people say, pay your tithes and receive blessings and receive all these things. Yes, Paul was a cornerstone of God's apostles, yet lists the things he went through on a daily basis. So as I said, note a Hebrew can be an Israelite as Paul, but an Israelite is not necessarily a Hebrew. Paul never called himself a Christian, nor had a wealthy, problem-free life as many Christians think coming to God gives. Wanting and judging, being blessed by wealth and prosperity, preacher principles, that's not how you identify you're a child of God. That is the method of Satan. Luke chapter 4 verse 6, and the devil said unto him, all this power will I give thee, and the glory of them, for that is delivered unto me, and to whomsoever I will I give it. So the devil can give prosperity and things like that. What he cannot give is what God can, eternal life and forgiveness of sins. Moving on to chapter 12, 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 8. For this thing I besought Yahweh 3 times, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. My comment. In Acts chapter 15 verses 2 and 6, it makes it clear the chapter is about this question or matter of circumcision for Gentiles and not the whole law of God. In Acts chapter 17 verse 30, it should again be clear the winked is limited to a single this ignorance of thinking God is made with human hands and no other ignorance. Many Christians similarly fail to understand that Paul's my grace is sufficient for thee has nothing to do with keeping God's law. Yet they regularly quote it as if it is. They only need to read the context of chapter 11 verses 29 to chapters 12 verse 10 to see it is not. Rather than take as gospel the teachings of Satan's transformed apostles of Christ, or ministers of righteousness as they make themselves, who are against the keeping of God's commandments as part of salvation. Continue from chapter 13, verse 2, the final warning in this epistle. I told you before and foretell you, as if I were present the second time, and being absent now I write to them which heretofore have sinned, and to all other, that if I come again I will not spare. Chapter 13 verse 7. Now I pray to God that you do no evil, not that we should appear approved, but that you should do that which is honest, though we be as reprobates. For we can do nothing against truth, but for the truth. My explanation. Evil is sin. We read this in Psalms chapters 51 verse 4, Ecclesiastes chapters 8 verse 12, Isaiah chapters 1 verse 4, Jeremiah chapter 36 verse 3. Paul clearly says we are not to sin. Some people say we are not under the law but under grace, in support of not being bound to keep the law. Others that it is impossible to keep the law. Does grace not have sin, laws or evil? Does grace not have sin, laws or evil, because Paul writes that believers are not to do such things? Sin and evil is transgression of the law of God. I would assume Paul was of the opinion that the law can be kept. Otherwise, why state the above, do no evil? God is not foolish to give laws that cannot be kept. Do not be deceived by nonsense, grace teachers or teachings of the deceivers. Remember Romans chapter 3:31, do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid, where we establish the law. What then, shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? God forbid. I say then, have God cast away his people? God forbid. For I am also an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. So God has not cast away the Jews and replaced them with Christians. And lastly, I repeat, but if, while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister, the teacher of sin? God forbid. Cannot be any clearer in those 3 or 4 last verses. If you want to see where the teachings of the chapters we covered today came from, where they came in the Old Testament, look on the video version at ReSky Facebook page to see where the Old Testament references of today's teachings come from. Shalom, until tomorrow, God willing.